PC building can be full of pitfalls, but today we've got you covered because I'm going to be going over some of the PC hardware components you should be avoiding, but not only that, we're going to be going over what you should get instead. Don't worry, I've got you. And what better place to start off with than 8GB graphics cards, more specifically ones that cost more than $200. If you didn't know, the problems with 8GB of VRAM are, it's basically the minimum amount of VRAM required in 2025 for AAA games, and not only that, if you do run out of VRAM, which can happen quite often with these GPUs, you're looking at quite a few performance problems like stuttering, muddy textures, or just even missing textures. We detailed this in a video recently, which you can watch after this one, when we dived into this topic in a bit more depth. And this is why I don't think you should spend more than $200 of your hard-earned money on an 8GB graphics card, and that's one of the reasons why it can be valid. The greatest budget sort of entry-level GPUs, like the RX 6600, and when they're costing less than $200, you can't really complain about not having that much VRAM, especially where it's kind of fine for 1080p rasterized performance, even with sort of high or ultra textures. And for esports gamers, VRAM doesn't really matter that much here, so if you were looking for a graphics card for like Counter-Strike, Fortnite or Valorant, those sorts of games, something like an RX 6600 for less than $200 is going to do you pretty decently. And then you've got this super budget GPUs like the RX 580 if you wanted mainly to play older games. A graphics card like this as well is going to be totally fine. And next up on our list is Intel CPUs for pure gaming PCs. What I mean here is if you're building your gaming PC, well, for just gaming, I don't think you should be buying an Intel processor, and to be honest, for Team Blue, they've kind of had it quite hard recently. They've had the 13th and 14th gen controversy where their CPUs were prematurely dying because of voltages and a few other problems, and the fact that their newest launch of the Core Ultra series isn't particularly great value. And it's these reasons, amongst their not so great efficiency levels, are why I don't recommend Intel processors for pure gaming PCs. However, if you're using your PC for work as well as gaming, like me, an Intel CPU is still a brilliantly viable product, as it will get the job done, albeit at not the greatest efficiency levels, but the work still gets done and the gaming still gets done, so you can't really complain too much. Oh, and if you're a video editor, you might want to go with Intel because of QuickSync, but Nvidia might have killed this off with their new RTX 50 series graphics cards, so there is that. But if you're building a primarily gaming focused build, AMD Ryzen is what you want. The X3D chips like the 9800 X3D, which is the gaming king right now, is around the same price as the Core Ultra 9 285K, yet it performs faster and it's a lot more efficient, so that's the CPU I'd go with there. But if you're looking for a more budget oriented system, you could always go with something like the Ryzen 5 7600 or 7700X. These CPUs are absolutely great and they don't use that much power at all, and they get on pretty well. So Intel CPUs, they aren't bad, but they're just not priced very well and they're very inefficient, so these are the main reasons why I'd avoid them for a pure gaming PC. Next up on our list, we have entry-level graphics cards. Throughout the course of PC gaming, these have been pretty terrible and not great value at all, and that continues into the modern day. On the entry level, we have the RX 6400, which is just not a great product at all. It's not priced well, it doesn't perform well in anything modern, and it lacks a few features like hardware encoders and such. And on Team Green, we've got the RTX 3050, 8GB and 16GB, and both of these graphics cards, yeah, they can play games and they do have like encoders and stuff, but they're still absolutely horrid value. But I'm not telling you to spend more, because for the same price as these graphics cards, you can get a banger of a used deal on something like an RX 6600, which is probably my budget entry level pick now. You can pick one of these up for around $150 used, and you're going to be getting more performance than the RTX 3050 for instance, and it uses less power as well, so yeah, that GPU is definitely a budget pick of mine right now. But if you want to stick to Team Green and you don't mind going back a generation, you could go with the RTX 2060 Super. This still has 8GB of VRAM, but with a 256-bit memory bus, and it will absolutely smoke an RTX 3050 in terms of performance, while using a bit more power, but that's a small trade-off, I think. But if you want to spend a little more cash, you could always go with a used RX 6700 XT. This is one of my most favorite graphics cards right now. It's a great pick, and it's also got 12 gigabytes of VRAM, which is 4 more than the RTX 3050 and RX 6600. But if you want to stick with new GPUs, you can readily pick up an RX 6600 for around $190. This is cheaper than a 3050, and yeah, it's quite a bit faster, especially in rasterization, and yeah, it's also cheaper, so that's definitely what I'd go with. So I'm not budget shaming any PC gamer out there, I just want you to get the most for your hard-earned cash, and buying an entry-level graphics card is not getting the most out of your money. Get something used like the RX 6600 instead, if you're on an absolute budget. Switching up to high-end hardware now, and what I don't recommend for pure gaming PCs is Ryzen 9s and Intel Core i9s and Core 9 Ultras, whatever they're calling it now. Anyways, these consumer workstation chips don't really see that much more gaming performance, particularly with the AMD Ryzen series, and they cost quite a bit more than a regular Ryzen 7 or i7 for instance. Also, not to mention, these chips can either cost the same, if not more, than something like the 7800 or 9800 X3D, which are the gaming kings right now, and you don't need any more than that for gaming. Well, you can't really get any more than that for gaming, so that's where I'd probably spend your money instead. Also, not to mention, with the Ryzen 9s and the i9s, you're going to need a much beefier cooler, which is going to eat into your budget for upgrading your gaming PC. So yeah, that's some money that you might want to allocate to your graphics card or your storage, or even your RAM. There is a caveat though, because if you're using your PC for both gaming and work, luckily the Ryzen 9s have got around the same performance as like a regular Ryzen 7 for instance. So if you needed the extra cores for maybe video editing or some other line of productivity work, they're still valid gaming CPUs, but if you're just purely gaming, it's basically wasted money, as you're not going to be using the extra cores with these CPUs. Speaking of wasted budgets, I see quite often on TikTok people pairing overkill coolers with like 65 watt CPUs. It just doesn't make sense. I've seen people pair NZXT Kraken coolers with like Ryzen 5 7600s, which has a TDP of like 65 watts. You do not need a cooler like that on a CPU which barely uses any power. Because with 9X Ryzen 5s and like the Intel Core i5s or the Ultra 5s or whatever they're called now, anyways, you don't really need a beefy cooler for these, and the stock cooler will probably be enough. Failing that though, if you want to overclock, especially the Ryzens, you can always go with something like the Thermalright Assassin. This is like 15 quid and it'll do a much better job than the stock cooler, and yeah, you're not wasting over £100 on a cooler, which is kind of wasted on a CPU like that. And the good news of this is, if you don't buy one of these overkill coolers, you can invest that budget elsewhere into your build. You might be able to get a better graphics card for instance, or maybe you might be able to get more RAM, an extra terabyte of storage, something that actually matters when you're playing games and doing all your productivity work and stuff like that. So that is what I'd recommend. Just save the money. You do not need coolers like this on a Ryzen 5. And speaking of cooling, don't buy a case that has terrible airflow, especially when there's great budget airflow cases on the market now. We really are spoilt for choices. We could always go with a case like the Corsair 3000D, Phanteks XT Pro, but if you want to go with a micro ATX case, you could always get the Montech Air 100 Lite, or failing that, if you want to stick with, say, NZXT, you could always get the H5 Flow in the new one, because that one's actually got proper fan support unlike the older H5s. And getting a case with good airflow is important, because after all, you want your components to breathe and not run at thermal throttling speed. So definitely get an airflow case, especially some of these listed today like cost like around like £50, which is not that much considering the amount of steel and tempered glass involved in PC cases these days. That's what I'd recommend. Don't get a PC case that's got a solid front panel now. There's just no need for it really. Cases with a tempered glass front panel, you don't really need to see your RGB fans through it. It's nice, but function over form. Come on, get an airflow case. Your PC components deserve it. So, I think we set the record straight in today's video. Hopefully you can save a bit of budget on your next gaming PC build and truly get the parts that matter to your gaming PC's performance. But speaking of performance, if you want to see how a solid 1440p graphics card gets on, you can check it out in the video up there. With that being said, I'll catch you in the next one.